Hello, Nova Scotia Community College students. I am Danny Stone, and thank you so much for having me here as a part of your African Canadian Heritage Month. I'm honored to be here. I'm an author, a speaker, a coach, a podcast host, but the most important thing that you need to know about me is I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. That's right. Although I'm living in Toronto, Ontario right now, I grew up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, in the north end of Dartmouth, and I'm super proud of that. And so I carry that everywhere that I go, and I always let people know that I'm from Nova Scotia. So I want to thank you for having me here to talk about African heritage and African Canadian history, because it's all of our history. It's people who paved the way for all of us to live the life that we're able to live. If it wasn't for people of African descent, none of us would be able to do some of the things that we're doing now. You wouldn't be able to go to community college with other students from other countries and other backgrounds if it wasn't for Black people and African Canadians who paved the way for all of us. And so I didn't always know that. I didn't always know my history. You know, recently I was sitting back and I was reflecting because I have 2 books out right now. I have one book out called You Have the Keys, Now Drive, which I wrote by myself. And I have another book that I wrote called New Me, with 9 other Black men. And the other day I was sitting down holding these 2 books in my hand, and something kind of came over me, because I remember in high school, I had 2 teachers that told me, they just said, Danny, you're not a good writer. Writing is not your thing. And they really discouraged me. And I carried that with me for a long time. And so as I'm sitting here a week ago and I'm looking at these books, the first thing I thought is, I wish I could find those teachers now and send them a copy of my book. But the other thing that I was thinking about is, not only was I able to write books that have reached readers in 8 different countries, even when I had teachers that told me that I was such a bad writer, but I was also reflecting and thinking about this. Was it that I was a bad writer? Or was it that I didn't want to write about my history and my ancestors as slaves? See, back then, all we were learning in school when it came to African Canadian history was that our ancestors were slaves. And that's where our history started. And so think about this. Who wants to write about their history and their history as them starting as slaves? I just didn't want to. And many of my friends didn't want to either. And so I was thinking about that. Like, maybe I just didn't want to read and write about all of my ancestors being stolen from their land and brought here as slaves. And so I was thinking about that. And here's what I realized as well. Nobody's history starts as you being a slave. It's impossible. It's impossible for a group of people's history to start as them being slaves, because to be a slave, you had to be free at one point and then enslaved. And so why didn't I learn about all of these amazing people in history? If I had of, then maybe I would have headed down the wrong path. See, I grew up in the north end of Dartmouth, and I love where I'm from. I love where I grew up, but I got into some trouble when I was younger. I was headed down the wrong path, and, you know, it was mentors and people who believed in me that helped me turn my life around. But I often think about, if I had known my history, if I had known about amazing people that looked like me, that helped to shape this country, that were my roots. If I had known about those individuals, then maybe I would have took a greater sense of pride in myself, and I didn't. But here's what I want to talk to you about today. This history is so important because it's allowed Canada to be what it is, right? It shaped this country. And so I want to talk to you about some prominent figures in Black history and African Canadian history. But the first thing I want to ask you is, who is the richest person in history? Who's the richest person in history? Is it Warren Buffett? Is it Bill Gates? Is it Jeff Bezos? Is it Elon Musk? Who's the richest person in history? I looked this up a few days ago, and recently it said that Jeff Bezos is worth about $186 billion. But guess what? He's not the richest person in history. The richest person in history is a former African emperor by the name of Mansa Musa. He was the wealthiest person ever. And he was born back in 1280. In the 1300s, he became this conqueror and really built up his wealth to the point where they think that he could have been worth anywhere from 400 or 500 billion dollars to over $1 trillion. And so he was this emperor and this ruler of Timbuktu, and he decided to go on this pilgrimage to Mecca. And along the way, he brought thousands and thousands of people with him. He brought tons of gold, and he would give people gold all along his journey and build mosques and just help to build up these small towns. And so I never knew about Mansa Musa. I never knew that the richest person in history in the last 720 plus years was an African emperor by the name of Mansa Musa. See, had I known that, maybe I would have took greater sense of pride in who I was and my ancestors. Had I known that the first African person to set foot on Canadian soil back in 1608 was Matthew da Costa, who was a free man. He was a free man. And actually, he was often hired by our explorers because he spoke 6 different languages. So he was an interpreter. He was African and Portuguese. I didn't know that the very first person of African descent to set foot on Canadian soil was a free man who spoke 6 different languages. That's amazing. I don't know about you, but I'm struggling with English. I'm having a hard time speaking English. Could you imagine back in the 1600s, a black man, an African, traveling to Canada as a free man, setting foot on Canadian soil as a free man, and was hired because he was an interpreter and he could speak 6 different languages, including Mi'kmaq. That's amazing. I wish I had known that growing up. See, it's important for all of us to know this history because this has all helped to shape Canada. It's all helped to shape our society that we're living in right now. Absolutely amazing. What about George Dixon? Have you heard about George Dixon? One of the most famous boxers ever. He was born back in 1870, I believe, in Africville, Nova Scotia. I'll talk to you about Africa in a minute. Africville, Nova Scotia. I'll talk to you about Africville in a minute. But George Dixon was only 5'3", this little tiny guy, maybe around 100 pounds. But in 1888, he became the first ever black champion of any sport. He became the first black boxing champion in bantamweight in 1888. Grew up in Nova Scotia in Africville. Isn't that amazing? So not only did he break that record, he also became the featherweight champion. So he was the first ever black person to hold 2 different boxing championship titles. And that was way back in 1888. It was amazing. And one of the things that they said about him is that he just had this stamina. He would fight. He would go on forever and ever in the boxing ring. And there's one fight that I think went over 4.5 hours long. Can you imagine? He was boxing for over 4.5 hours long. And to this day, he's fought over 800 fights back then. And to this day, I think that record stands with over 800 fights. The average boxer right now might fight maybe 50, 60 fights, 80 fights at the most. George Dixon fought 800 fights. And so a lot of people in the boxing world read about George Dixon. He's one of the most prolific boxers, but I didn't know that growing up. I had to go and find that out later on my own because school never taught me that. And so this is a history that we all need to be aware of. You're living in Nova Scotia. This is amazing Nova Scotian history that has helped to shape the city and this country. So I wish I had known about George Dixon growing up. And George Dixon was from Africville. And Africville was this thriving black community back in the 1700s. Africville was this bustling community of black people who decided that they didn't want to be discriminated against when they were living in the city of Halifax and so on. So they decided to move on the outskirts. And what they did was they built up their own community. They built schools, they built a church, they built houses. And they were, even though they were paying taxes, the city of Halifax wouldn't give them any types of services. They never had sewage, they never had running water, they never had roads that were paved. And so they were just kind of left on their own to survive. And what happened was it really became this thriving community. You know, Africville is the oldest black community in Canada. And people around the outskirts got jealous of the community, and they went to the city and they described it as a ghetto back in the 1950s and 60s. So what the city of Halifax decided to do was go and put a garbage dump and a sewage plant right in the middle of the community to try to drive them out. That's right. Right in the middle of their community. They tried to force them out of the community. And then eventually, I believe it was in 1960s, they drove them out of there. They went and bulldozed their homes and made them move from Africville. And that was the story of Africville. And to this day, you know, it's still this historical site of black prominence in Canada. And even though the community was demolished, there is a Africville Museum there. So I highly advise you, if you've never been to the Africville Museum, you go there and learn about this history. It was such a rich culture. There's so many descendants of Africville that still live in Nova Scotia. And that's just an amazing history. And so these are the stories that I never knew growing up. And I wish that I knew these stories. I'm sure that you've heard of Viola Desmond. Viola Desmond was a woman that was born in 1914 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. She was a Canadian activist, and she was a businesswoman. She owned her own beauty school, and she taught other women to start their own businesses. And in 1946, she was in a movie theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, and she sat in the whites only area. And she got arrested for that. She refused to move. She got arrested for that. And then that started the whole Canadian civil rights movement. And really, it's because of her that the whole movement forged forward. And by the way, this was 9 years before Rosa Parks refused to get off of the bus. This was in 1946. Rosa Parks refusing to get up from the bus was 1955. See, we always hear about Rosa Parks, but many of us don't know about Viola Desmond. And so I think it's so important that we know this history, and that we know this because it's helped us to become who we are. And I didn't know this growing up. I didn't know all of these amazing African Canadians who paved the way, who struggled, who some lost their lives for me to be able to stand here and talk to you today. You know, another great Canadian that many of you may not know is Rocky Johnson. Rocky Johnson is the father of one of the most famous people in the world, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He was actually born in Amherst, Nova Scotia. Did you know that? Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's father was born in Amherst, Nova Scotia back in 1944, I believe it was. And he was a wrestler. So he really got into bodybuilding. He really became this really massive bodybuilder. Then he got into wrestling. He left Nova Scotia and came to Toronto to wrestle in a wrestling league here. Became really great. Ended up joining the WWE, which was a massive wrestling league. And he and his tag team partner, Tony Atlas, were known as Soul Patrol. And Soul Patrol became the first ever black champions in wrestling history. In 1983, they became the tag team champions in the WWE, and they were the first black champions in wrestling. His father went on to become a Hall of Famer, a wrestling Hall of Famer, and unfortunately he died just last year. But The Rock did this amazing tribute to his dad, and he credits his dad for getting him into weight training. He said when he was young, he used to go to the gym with his dad, and he used to see his dad lift these massive weights. And The Rock said he always remembers the sound of the weights clanging and banging, and he just became addicted to weightlifting. So The Rock got into weightlifting, and then he got into wrestling. And for a while, his dad, Rocky Johnson, actually trained him. And so The Rock credits his dad with getting him into weight training, having discipline in his life, and then getting into wrestling. That's a story that, again, I didn't know that. That's amazing. It's amazing to know that one of the most famous people in the world, his father, is from Nova Scotia. And so I'm telling you all these stories because I didn't know, and maybe you don't know, or maybe you do know some of these stories. But let me share another story with you. Last week, I was speaking to some incarcerated men virtually. I was talking to them about some of the things that I'm talking to you about now. And at the end of the presentation, one of the inmates steps up and he says, "Danny, man, that was amazing. I wish I had known some of this information growing up. I didn't know that. I didn't know that we had all these amazing black people. I didn't know that the richest person in the world was an African emperor. And I wish I had known that, because maybe I would have made some different decisions in my life." Then another inmate speaks up. He said almost the same thing. He said, "Danny, like, this is information we were never taught." And he said, "You know what? I didn't like who I was growing up. I hated myself. And because I didn't like myself and I hated myself, it was easy for me to hate other people and to be aggressive towards other people and not care about other people." And he said, "I don't know if me knowing this information would have changed that for me, but," he goes, "if I knew this information growing up, maybe I would have took a little bit more pride in who I was as a person, as opposed to thinking that I was just a slave and I was a nobody, and that's that my ancestors were slaves. And so I just grew up feeling like I was nobody and I was nothing." He said, "Man, this is so amazing, brother. Thank you so much for sharing this. I'm definitely going to go and do my research and find out more about my ancestry and my history." And I just sat there and I said, man, this is what it's about. We have to learn to educate ourselves. These are inmates right now that never knew any of this information, and said that if they had known this information, maybe that they might have taken a different path. They can't say that, but maybe they might have had more pride in who they were, or maybe they would have felt more worthy than what they did. And I couldn't believe that they said that. So this history is all of our history. And it's important that we all know this. And so I just want to let you know that we're talking about the past, but we can be history makers right now. We don't have to wait until Black History Month or African Heritage Month to do our research and to find out about people who've come before us. We don't have to wait until February to buy from Black-owned businesses and support Black-owned businesses. We don't have to wait until we see some type of injustice or civil unrest with people of African descent before we step up and say something. We can be an ally. We can see something, or we can get ahead of this by helping to improve the lives of African Canadians all across this country. We don't have to wait. And one of the things I want to leave you with is a good friend of mine, Mark Stoddard. He and some other people got together and they put together this amazing video I'm about to show you. And the video is of Black love and Black families. And so Mark, this poet named Nigel, and this trumpeter named Rudy, and a bunch of other people got together and they said, you know what? We don't see a lot of positive images of Black families and Black love, and we want to do something about it. So they decided to start this whole movement, and they put together this amazing video that I'm about to show you. And I'm telling you right now, this video is going to be timeless. People are going to be looking at this from 5 years from now, 10, 50, 100 years from now. And I'm saying this because they started this video thinking about our ancestors. They thought about our ancestors' journey. They thought about the struggles and the challenges that we've had, the civil rights movement, all the unrest in Canada and around the world over the years. And they thought, we need to show ourselves that we're worthy. We need to show ourselves in a positive light. We need to show ourselves that there are loving Black families, that there is Black love. And so they decided to put this together. And so I want you to watch this, take a look at this and take it in, and then I'll come back and wrap up.
Dearly beloved, we've been gathered here today to get through this thing called life. And we won't view our melanin through the hate they give, hide our skin under rhetoric used to dilute the consciousness to forget who we are. We are the beloved ones, charcoal brown molded under the golden sun. Sons of kings, queens of a lineage we refuse to leave behind. We are beloved, unwilling to let love die. Unwilling to let love die, but willing to let love live. Pain won't shortchange our heritage. Links to unbroken bonds stretch beyond these scars. We've come too far to close off the middle passage to our inner God. We are beloved ones. This pen writes with the spirit of Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison. We rebuke the notion that Nubians can't love flawed. We're fractured but hopeful, knowing skin and bones can forge new bonds. Healing can shed the hurt but pack on thicker layers of love. Slavery has made us run in the opposition of agape's direction. Survival has made us numb to its texture. Spirit is the way back to our pursuit of happiness. Our queens are waiting for a syringe filled with affirmations to be injected. Indiscretions of love have gone on for far too long. Can you imagine what would have happened if we were unshackled from Jim Crow with wings to soar back home? Along shorelines that house ships that brought us some kingdoms now forgotten. Never forget who you are. We are loving, soft, warm, willing to push past the roughage that says we're too strong. Let's allow our ancestors to feed us history, digest what it feels like to be held with tomorrow morning, to kiss without grievances on lips. Refuse to lift tongues on caskets that speak death into our optimism. Set your sights on more than what you bargained for we are wholesale, shipping for understanding, far beyond the eastern seaboard. Staring our destiny to our lovers' arms, we are beloved ones. Larger than limitations, louder than yesterday's whispers. Let's spray paint new scriptures over an old constitution and rewrite the dead weight of a narrative we've been carrying for far too long. Let love become the new pyramid scheme, tomb raiding our pain, reclaiming our promised land and merging light with love. We are the beloved ones. Charcoal brown molded under the golden sun. Dearly beloved, we've been gathered here today to get through this thing called life.
Welcome back. How was that video for you? Every time I see that video, I just feel it in my heart. I feel it because it's such powerful yet simple images of Black families enjoying themselves. Black love. We don't see those images. And so I just wanted to show that to you because I showed this to the inmates and they just absolutely loved it. I've been showing it to other people that I've been speaking to, and they absolutely love it as well. And so I just wanted to share it with you. I want to leave you with this. I want to say, first of all, thank you to the Student Association, in particular, the Ivany and Aviation campuses. Thank you so much for having me here. And I want to leave you with this. There's something special about you. Find out what it is and live it out loud. There's something special about you. Regardless of the struggles you may be going through or the difficult times you may have had or the failures that you may have had or the mistakes, just like our ancestors, you have to keep going. And don't quit on yourself. If you have a goal or a dream, find a way to make it happen. That's all I want to leave you with. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here to speak to you today. Definitely honored. Take care.